Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Skyfall F1 podcast. My name's Aiden, I'm going to be your host again today, and welcome in for our first episode of the off season. Already something to discuss here, as Sergio Perez has been removed from his seat for the 2025 season. Perez had a contract extension for 2025 and 2026 that he signed prior to the British Grand Prix. However, his performance was not up to the standards that Red Bull wanted, as was made pretty clear throughout the season. Various Q1 exits, various crashes in both qualifying and races. So ultimately, the decision was made to remove Sergio from his seat at Red Bull. Today, it was announced that his replacement will be Liam Lawson from RB. So, a couple things I'm going to want to discuss over the course of this episode. Was it Checo's time to go? Is Liam Lawson the right decision for Red Bull? And what to make of Yuki Tsunoda, who is left at RB. He's been passed up for the job for, well, the first time, but truly his best chance to get the Red Bull seat, excuse me, and he was unable to get it. What does that mean for him in the future? So the first thing I want to talk about, was it Sergio Perez's time to go? Was it time for him to end his Formula One career? I think so. Now, I've seen some people trying to argue that Checo didn't really deserve his seat initially. He should have been out in 2020. I believe that is patently false. He won his first race with an excellent drive in the Secure Grand Prix in 2020. He earned the right to be on the grid in 21, and ultimately, it was never Checo's job to compete with Max. He was there to complement Max in the same way that Valtteri Bottas was ultimately there at Mercedes to complement Lewis Hamilton during their championship winning seasons. So Checo's job, beside Max, was not to win the races. That was simply a bonus, not the expectation of him. As a complimentary driver, his job was to be consistent, keep it on the track, and defend like a madman when one of Max's championship rivals came near him, as he did in Abu Dhabi, as he did in Turkey, both in 2021. So he did a very, very good job of that on several occasions and over the course of several seasons. 2021, obviously finishing fourth place in the Drivers' Championship, winning the Azerbaijan Grand Prix, the first of two times he won it for Red Bull, and that excellent defense in Abu Dhabi. And even though it ultimately wasn't the determining factor in the race, it was huge for him to really give Red Bull a chance to step back into that race and feel like they had a shot to compete for the title, even though Lewis was clearly the faster driver in Abu Dhabi in that race. In 2022, it was much of the same for Checo. 2 wins over the course of the season in Monaco, of course, and then in Singapore later in the year, finished third in the Drivers' Championship. He did an excellent job that season. Obviously, an unfortunate DNF in Bahrain, but outside of that, very consistent. Only placed outside of the top five once outside of that season opener. 2023, an outstanding start to the season. 4 podiums in the first 5 races, including wins in both Saudi Arabia and Azerbaijan, and not finishing outside of the top five in any of those 5 races. Then you look forward and you see Monaco, where he won last year, and suddenly he crashed. Crashed in qualifying, was then able to make up the places in a tight street circuit. After that, it didn't seem like the cracks were showing as much. He was continuing to perform well, put on a couple podiums, and then a retirement in Japan that was very strange. Only finishing 10th in Qatar as his teammate won both the sprint and the Grand Prix, retiring at his home race in Mexico City. He still performed very well, finishing second overall in the Drivers' Championship, but the cracks were starting to show there. I think the Miami Grand Prix there, where Max was far down the order after an unfortunate qualifying and came back to win the race with Checo finishing second. I think that was one of the moments where you start to see Checo start to lose his confidence a bit. He started to crash more consistently in qualifying after that and in the races. Both of his retirements on the season came after that race. I think that was where his confidence started to tail off. And then in 2024, you could really, really see that. Checo finished in the top five in the first 5 races again, but then we hit the Imola Grand Prix, knocked out before reaching Q3 for the first time that season, and was able to recover to P8, but that was it. Monaco crashed in qualifying, knocked out in Q1, was unfortunately crashed out by Kevin Magnussen in the Grand Prix. Wasn't necessarily his fault, but It's still DNF that race. Then you hit Canada, crashes into the wall with nobody around him, completely of his own volition. And that's another moment where you see his lack of confidence really starting to affect him there. You head to the British Grand Prix, gets beached in the gravel during Q1, knocked out again, and ends up finishing the race in 17th place. Finishes 7th in Hungary after another crash in qualifying. At this point, they're really starting to build up. This is just the first half of the season. The amount of times Checo was crashing in Q1 was getting kind of ridiculous at this point. Very solid qualifying in Belgium, but then just completely fell off when it came to race pace. Started on the front row of the grid, finished in P7. Just not the pace you want to see. And you can see again and again, beside Verstappen, you have Max crashing into Lando Norris while fighting for the lead of the Austrian Grand Prix. Gets a 10-second penalty and has a puncture and is forced to pit. Still finishes ahead of his teammate. That just should not be happening. Even if, like I said, he is a complimentary driver, you still need to be able to compete in those kinds of scenarios. And then as you get down the stretch, you can just see his confidence is completely shattered. Baku, I believe, was really the last straw for him. He qualified ahead of Max. It was the only time he did that all season. He was in a podium place, actually took second place away from Charles Leclerc for a second before losing second and third to Carlos Sainz and Leclerc before crashing with Sainz, ending his race and completely obliterating whatever confidence he may have had left. He head to Singapore, barely in the points after fighting his way back. US Grand Prix, non-factor in the race. Mexican Grand Prix, horrendous day for him after a false start off the grid, parked outside of the grid box on the formation lap, finished 17th. It was the second consecutive poor result at his home Grand Prix, and there were actually a lot of rumors that he would not continue racing, that he would be retiring after the Mexican Grand Prix, which of course proved to be unfounded. Then you head to Sao Paulo, where even in a race where Max was able to climb from 17th all the way to the win, Liam Lawson and Yuki Tsunoda, the two RB drivers, both finishing well into the points. Checo couldn't manage even 10th in the Grand Prix. He just could not find any consistency in that race and finished outside the points because of it. Vegas, knocked out in Q2, barely able to squeak out a point, and that was one of the races where we actually saw Checo's racecraft coming to life a bit. I'll get to that in a minute. And then retires in the final two Grand Prix of the season. Abu Dhabi was not his fault, in my opinion. Qatar absolutely was. He spun under a safety car prior to having I believe it was a gearbox failure. The failure occurred afterwards, is what we've been told. So, not really much defense there for Checo on that DNF. So, all this is to say, finishing 8th in the Drivers' Championship when your teammate wins the championship is completely inexcusable, and I completely understand why Red Bull chose to move on from Checo at the conclusion of the season. There was also the fact that he just cost them too much money from crashing. He crashed so consistently, the team had to repair his car constantly. That, I think, was the ultimate deciding factor. They could deal with the poor performance because of the money he was bringing in, but now the financial factor is not there because he's costing them millions in repairs. So at that point, you're undoing the one thing that was keeping you with the team. Why would the team keep you? So he had no pace in the races, as we saw in Belgium, where he was just unable to compete. As we saw several times in qualifying, only out-qualified Max once over the course of the year, the least amount of times that he had out-qualified Max in his time with Red Bull. He was unreliable, crashing far too much, and his racecraft, which I mentioned earlier, was just non-existent. He was known as the Mexican Minister of Defense simply because he was so good at defending. He was so good at keeping his positions even against faster cars. But now he just seemed like completely unwilling to go for any semi-audacious overtake. He seemed completely unwilling to keep anybody behind him. The biggest example of this that I can think of was the United States Grand Prix. He was in a quicker car behind Yuki Tsunoda in the RB and was just unable to make any kind of move, was stuck behind Yuki for 3 laps in a significantly faster car. It was so puzzling to see a driver known for just launching it on the defense, and he was just unable to even make a basic overtake with DRS. It was so strange to see. So ultimately, I do believe it was Checo's time to go, and I do believe that Red Bull made the right decision there. Now, did they make the right decision in who is replacing Checo? I do not believe so. Liam Lawson is the one that they made the call to bring up. I don't see how this is ever going to end well for Lawson. Let me preface what I'm about to say with the fact that I think Liam Lawson is a good driver. I do believe that ultimately he will earn that Red Bull seat. I don't think it was for this season, though. I believe that he needed at least one more year of seasoning in the RB, and there are so many examples of this just from Red Bull. You see Pierre Gasly, 26 race starts for Toro Rosso prior to his call up to Red Bull, struggled. Alex Albon, 12 total Grand Prix starts prior to his call up to Red Bull in mid 2019 and also struggled. Neither were able to outqualify their teammate Max Verstappen a single time during their stints at Red Bull. And that's not to say these were untalented drivers. Gasly just got his fifth podium in his career in the Sao Paulo Grand Prix. He put it in on the second row in Las Vegas in an Alpine, a team that had struggled to find pace for the majority of the season. Now he heads into next season having crawled his way all the way up to P10 in the Drivers' Championship. An excellent comeback from him in a car that really just did not deserve to be as high as he was putting it towards the end of the season. And Albon, of course, dragging an absolute tractor for Williams in 22 and 23 into the points pretty consistently, able to outperform all three teammates he's had to this point. Both of these drivers have shown that they can be solid for midfield teams, but they were just unprepared and didn't have the confidence they needed to go up against a driver like Max. And that's not their fault. That I'm going to blame completely on Red Bull because you brought in drivers with one of them just over a full year of experience, one of them just a half season of experience to put alongside one of the best drivers on the grid. And you can't expect those drivers to ever be able to gain confidence when they're constantly being outqualified, when they're constantly being beaten out in the final classifications. So I don't see how it's going to go any better with Lawson. I'm sure Red Bull's looking at this like, oh, he's got more mental fortitude than those guys. He's this really strong-willed guy, which I agree he definitely is. You can see that in his battles with guys like Fernando Alonso, both on and off the track. But I just don't see how it's going to go any better for Liam, given the fact that they've already got two examples of talented drivers who came in inexperienced in a Red Bull car and were unable to compete with Verstappen. I'm 100% confident Lawson will not be able to compete with Verstappen, and I'm 99% confident that he's going to lose all confidence that he had coming in and competing with Yuki when he's unable to beat Max. So I just don't see how this is a very good idea. I don't see how it's going to work out for Red Bull at all, especially in the long term when you consider the driver that they snubbed for this, Yuki Tsunoda. What is Yuki's future in F1? He has now been completely passed up for a Red Bull seat. Red Bull clearly has zero plans for him in the long term. And before you say Christian Horner came out and said the decision came down to the wire, it's a blatant lie at this point. Several articles have been published, including one by F1 correspondent Lawrence Barretto, confirming that it was made before Yuki even stepped in for the postseason tire tests. The decision was always Liam. Yuki was never in consideration, no matter what jargon comes out of Horner's mouth at this point. So, what is Yuki's future? Obviously, he's in the RB for 2025, likely to compete with Isaac Hadjar. We'll talk about him a bit more in a second. But where does he go from there? If he has no future with Red Bull going to the main team at any time, then he's got to find another place to move on, try to find somewhere where he can go compete for podiums and race wins, because it's not going to happen in that RB. It's just simply not going to. I believe the best option for Yuki moving forward is Aston Martin. I know that's a name that's been tossed out with several drivers. Ultimately, I don't believe it's a realistic one, but I think if any driver is going to go there, it's going to be Yuki. He is in F1 primarily due to his heavy connections with Honda. He got the Red Bull test because of his connections with Honda, and Aston Martin will be the sole Honda-powered team for the foreseeable future. That is realistically the only reason why he would be going over there. The question is, who would he even be driving alongside? Lance Stroll has proven time and time again over the course of the last several seasons he does not belong in F1. Just think of the Sao Paulo Grand Prix where he drove straight into the gravel trap with zero prompting whatsoever, just completely ended his own race through an act of stupidity. He's not fit to drive an F1 anymore, but it doesn't matter. His father shows zero interest in moving him to their new endurance championship team, so we can't predict that Stroll is going to be out of the team and making way for Yuki in 2026. And we also can't predict that Fernando Alonso is going to be out of the team making space for Yuki in 2026 because he is signed through the end of that season. Now, beyond that, you will not have Alonso. He is all but confirmed to be retiring following the conclusion of that contract. But at the same time, if Max Verstappen sticks around and gets any more fed up with Red Bull, he could choose to follow Adrian Newey over there. That has been a heavy rumor. Stroll has been heavily pursuing Verstappen in the same way that he pursued Newey. If he could convince Newey, I'm sure he could convince Max in the same way. So I am not entirely sure who Yuki would be driving beside, or if a space would ever open up for him to go over there. So what other options does he have? He has proven over the last 4 seasons that he deserves a spot in F1 for whatever team he can get on. I think the best option for him outside of Aston is Alpine. Alpine are a team that, yes, they struggled for the majority of 2024, but made an excellent comeback towards the end. A couple upgrades seem to have changed their performance almost as much as McLaren's upgrades changed their performance in 2023. They have also been freed from the Renault engine burden in the long term. They've signed a Mercedes customer deal for engines from 2026 onwards. That could definitely provide a boost in performance. And above all else, you have the connection between Alpine's current number one driver, Pierre Gasly, and Yuki Tsunoda from when they drove together at AlphaTauri in 2021 and 2022. In recent years, the driver pairings at Alpine have been contentious to say the least. Obviously, their most recent pairing for 2023 and 2024 of Pierre Gasly and Esteban Ocon had their famous French Civil War incidents where they would crash on track and then flame each other in the media following the Grand Prix. Prior to that, you had Ocon paired with Fernando Alonso, the pairing that ultimately forced Alonso out of the team he won 2 world championships for in 05 and 06 because they were just unable to keep together. Obviously, the famous quote, "Never before in my life have I seen a defender as good as Esteban," coming from Alonso during the 2022 season. So I think Alpine may be looking to kind of change the narrative surrounding their driver pairings. Obviously, we've yet to see what Pierre Gasly will be like alongside Jack Doohan, their new rookie that came in for the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. The jury's still out on what Doohan will be able to accomplish in F1. We'll see what that will ultimately come to. If Doohan is unable to succeed in 2025 or 2026 and Alpine are forced to look elsewhere, I think they should be looking at Yuki Tsunoda. Obviously, that established relationship exists, and there would definitely be significantly better aura surrounding the team's driver pairings than there have been in the past. So, the final thing I want to talk about is what happens if Yuki leaves RB. And would it have been a terrible idea to keep Checo around as a security net if Yuki leaves after 2025? Now, I don't know that this was an option at all for Red Bull. I'm not sure how contentious the discussions were following the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix regarding Checo's departure from the team. I don't know if him returning as a reserve driver was ever an option. But if it was, would it have been a good idea for Red Bull to retain him? Isaac Hadjar, unconfirmed to be the RB seat, but he seems likely to succeed Lawson. There's not really many other options outside of stray reserve drivers or somebody like Zhou Guanyu, who, let's be real, that's not happening. So if Yuki parts ways with the Red Bull family after 25, who partners him up? Is it Arvid Lindblad? Is it Pepe Marti? Those are the 2 Red Bull F2 drivers that are currently out there. Lindblad set to make his debut alongside Marti at Campos this season. Of course, Lindblad is going to be 18 years old by the conclusion of the 2025 F2 season, so maybe a little young. They may want to season him a bit more, but if he comes up and does what Gabriel Bortoleto did and wins the championship in his first year, obviously I could see them pairing him with Isaac Hadjar at RB. I think a good benchmark is going to be against Marti. Hadjar handled Marti in head-to-head over the course of their time as teammates. If Lindblad is able to come in and do the same thing, is he going to be in heavy consideration for a 2026 seat? Again, pending Yuki's departure. Or do you go after a veteran like what you have in Yuki right now? Yuki is heading into his fifth F1 season, and that's primarily the reason I believe they're keeping him at RB is to be the benchmark. They don't believe he's good enough to be in the Red Bull, but they do believe he's good enough to be a benchmark for what they want out of their young drivers. So, would it be a good idea for Red Bull to snag somebody else that has 5, 6 years of experience? But you have guys like Ocon, you have guys like Zhou Guanyu, you have guys like Kevin Magnussen that is out of the sport, but still young enough where he could realistically be a pretty good mentor for somebody in that RB seat in 2026. Would they want to snag a veteran there? And if that's the case, Checo was a premier midfield driver for a decade in the sport, driving for Sauber, driving for Force India, which became Racing Point. He has tons of experience being one of the best midfield drivers, and that's ultimately what got him the seat in Red Bull in the first place. Would it have been a good idea to keep him around? Maybe give him a year off as a reserve driver, let him test in simulators, or even toss him in the second RB seat this year? Give him a break, put him in a midfield car, take the pressure off of him, then bring him back if he's necessary in 2026 partner Hajar. I'm not sure if it would have worked. It's just kind of something to chew on as we move forward. And we'll see if this is the end of Sergio Perez's career as a Formula One driver. He has been connected with Cadillac, but so has Valtteri Bottas, so has Colton Herta, current IndyCar driver for Andretti. So has Logan Sargent, although I see that as very unlikely. We'll see what becomes of Checo in the both near and long-term future, what becomes of his racing career. That is something I will definitely be sure to follow along with and keep you all updated on. For now, see you next time.